Good evening or afternoon or morning, really, depending on where you were tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for Unstoppable, Siggi B. Wilzig's astonishing journey from Auschwitz survivor and penniless immigrant to Wall Street legend. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you will visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which is opening on December 7th, 2025. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Joshua M. Green and Michael Berenbaum. Joshua is a popular lecturer on Holocaust history and an author whose biographies have sold more than a half. Green's groundbreaking book on the Dachau war crimes trials, Justice at Dachau, the Trials of an American Prosecutor, was deemed riveting historical writing at its best by Douglas Brinkley, presidential historian for CNN. He is the 2022 Laurel Vlock Fellow at the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University. Michael is a writer, lecturer, and teacher consulting in the conceptual development of museums and the development of historical films. He is the director of the Siggi Ziering Institute, exploring the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust at the American Jewish University, formerly the University of Judaism, where he is also a distinguished professor of Jewish studies. So we have two very distinguished people with us this evening. So you can publish Unstoppable at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Joshua and Michael.
Okay, good evening, good morning, good afternoon. Joshua Green and I are longtime friends, so we're going to be on a first name easy basis. We'll banter a little bit and hopefully, despite the nature of the subject, have a little bit of fun with it. Josh, tell us a little bit about who Siggi Wilzig was and why you could truthfully describe him as unstoppable.
Yes, Siggi Wilzig, born in Janka, West Prussia in 1933, was a volcano. He learned at a very young age to develop very adult skills of observation in order to survive the anti-Semitic environment in that part of Eastern Europe. He learned to run fast and make very quick decisions, skills that he took with him when he was deported to Auschwitz just before his 17th birthday. As an example of his survival skills, he at the point of debarking, what is the word I'm looking for? Getting off the train. He told the guard, said, "How old are you?" He said, 18. Now he does know. Later he said, "I don't know where that impulse came from, but it saved my life because anyone younger was sent off to the gas chambers." And often that would be the case.
Let me interrupt for only for 1 second. I heard you say 1933. What year was he actually born in? Because if he was 17 arriving in Auschwitz, it couldn't have been 33.
longer I live, the more I remember. I'm trying to get away from the past, but it isn't possible. I am not liberated yet. I live in Auschwitz every day.
I was born in 26 in Koyanke. It was West Prussia, about 155 miles northeast of Berlin. In 35, we left everything, and the next morning we were in Berlin. Kristallnacht, I was 12 years old as a child, and you see synagogues burn, Jewish homes go up in flames, and the police not doing anything. It was like the end of the world. They called it evacuation. That was the word. When the trains pulled up, I looked out of the window. I know we were going east. But going east didn't mean Auschwitz. We didn't know there was an Auschwitz. How do you survive 2 years of Auschwitz? It was not my education, which I didn't have any. It was my brain, which I didn't have much. It was the hand of God. What did I do next? I acquired control of Wilshire Oil Company of Texas, a little oil company. I bought it piece by piece by piece by piece. I was only the second Jew to become a president of a bank.
What kinds of nightmares do you have?
Very bad. It's something that is there. You are in Auschwitz every day. I wouldn't want to be anything else. If I would have to go through, God forbid, the same thing, I would go through the same thing as a Jew.
So there you've seen Siggi speaking in his own words. That was compiled from testimony that he gave for the Shoah Foundation in 2003, just a few months before he passed away. And of course, it drives home, Michael, doesn't it, the power of video testimony, especially now that the survivor population is all but gone. We do have their words and emotions and body language and expressions in video to bring us closer to the experiences of those who went through the Shoah. That's your forte, Michael. I've always been deeply impressed with how much you have become a part of the expression of Holocaust memory through film. So thank you for everything that you've done there.
You know, part of that for me was that I grew up surrounded, my parents were American. They were actually what we would call dreamers. And they came to the United States as my mother came here at 6 months, my father at 6 years. But I grew up surrounded by the Holocaust because I was taught by survivors and refugees. And I also was in a synagogue that was comprised of German and Belgian Jews who had come here in the nick of time because they were in the diamond business and had resources that were mobile. So I was surrounded by it, but they didn't articulate a story. And I understood, and I must have understood subconsciously, that there was a deep backstory to who these men and women were, but they weren't telling it, at least not in my generation. And then lo and behold, what you know and what we lived through, because you've been involved with the Fortunoff archives for a long time, is precisely as the technology enabled us to record people in video inexpensively, they got the opportunity to tell their story. And between the Fortunoff archive and then the Shoah archive, we compiled an incredible range of testimonies, and you have worked with these testimonies all the way through. Let's talk a little bit about Siggi and then talk about your other biographies, because you've written an incredible number of biographies, especially for young people. But tell us a little bit about what made Siggi this unique figure. We just heard about his being in the oil business and being one of the Jewish bankers in the early times, but he was more than that.
Very good. Yes, the reason why I accepted to do Siggi Wilzig's story, Michael, is that for the past 90 years or so, there is this misleading narrative that has been allowed to dominate the impression of the attitude and role and response of Jews during the Second World War to their fate as sheep being led to the slaughter. Well, not only is that insulting, it's also historically inaccurate. And Siggi Wilzig's story gives the lie to that misimpression. Here is someone who vividly embodied the response of the Jewish people. Now, of course, we cannot universalize the Holocaust experience. Not everyone was capable of doing what Siggi did, but it's misleading to think that there was a lack of response, a lack of resistance. I remember, Michael, a group here on Long Island that approached me a few years ago asking if I would help them make a documentary about survivors who had made their home on Long Island. So I said, okay, send me something about what you want to do. And they forwarded a flyer, and the flyer said, these people are our heroes and role models. They remind us of the human spirit. They remind us of the will to survive. And by this documentary film, we seek to bring them the attention and praise that they deserve. Okay, it was a timeout for a minute here. The 6 million who didn't survive, they didn't have a human spirit. They didn't have a will to survive. I think sometimes this language of survival as synonymous with heroism says more about our need for closure than it does about the actual reality of history.
But yet, what we see David Marwell once said it beautifully in one very important sentence. He said, just because Jews were powerless does not mean they were passive.
Right.
And that is that we have to understand, and I keep thinking of this because I think that we don't believe that people who are in difficult circumstances still have agency. And you and I both worked with the late, great Larry Langer, who said there became a moment in the Holocaust when you had no agency. But that was at the end, that was in the camps. Not early on, not all the way through, but you have the capacity to deal with your circumstances. And then part of what Siggi represents is something else for survivors, which is resiliency.
Yes, let me give you a couple of examples. After having spent 2 years in Auschwitz, Siggi was sent on a death march. And it was the dead of winter. And during the night when the SS would bed the survivors down in the cold and snow, and they would take shelter in a warm barn somewhere, Siggi asked himself, what do I have to survive? What can I do? He noticed that his shoes, these were wooden shoes that were held together by very, very frail shoelaces. The shoelaces in the cold and snow and slush had broken. They deteriorated and fallen away, and the shoes were rubbing up against the heel of his feet. Now, if you came out of a concentration camp, your body had no resources to fight off infection. So if there had been, even from a slight splinter, an infection, it would have killed him. He looked around, and the only thing he had with him was a spoon that he had taken from the camp. And with that spoon, rubbing it back and forth on a rock, it had a little bit of an edge that you could cut with. He saw a small sapling and went over to the sapling, crawled over, and using that spoon, scored strips of bark from the tree, braided them together, rubbed them between his hands to warm them up, and created shoelaces, wrapped them around his wooden shoes, and very, very carefully stood and saw that they were holding. Later, he said, where did such an idea come from? How does someone get an idea like that? He says, only the Almighty could put an idea like that in my mind. So while many people lost their faith during the Holocaust, Siggi Wilzig was someone who found cause for reinforcement of his Judaism and his faith. And there were other moments like that. It was one of the things that I think compelled me to try to tell his story, that there were so many such moments like that in his testimony. There was a moment when he took, after the liberation, he was working for the agency of the army that was collecting evidence to be used in the war crimes trials against those Nazis who had been arrested. And Siggi was sent on his first airplane ride. And he was 19 years old at this point. And he'd never been on a plane before. And he described that it was a cloudy, rainy, overcast day. And the plane took off and went up through the cloud bank. And on the other side, it was a bright, beautiful day. The sun was shining. And he said, in that moment, God was talking to me. God was speaking to me. He was saying, don't despair. Don't give in to the despair. He says, sometimes a cloud like Hitler comes between us, but I'm still here. I'm here. That's the kind of a Jew Siggi Wilzig was. He found cause to reinforce his faith in sometimes the smallest of things.
But he was also one other type of Jew, which is a tough one. And, I keep remembering the story, and I'm going to ask you to tell it. When a bunch of goons from Texas came up to try to intimidate him. And he's meeting with them in his boardroom, but you continue the story because it tells you the audacity that he developed and also the fact that he wasn't going to give in to fear.
No, never. He arrived here at age 21 with $200 that he had managed to save working for the army after liberation. And he made 3 vows. He said, I'm never going to go hungry again. I'm going to marry a Jewish woman and have Jewish children and support the Jewish people. And whenever I see injustice, I'm going to speak up. I'm not going to be silent. He taught himself to read the stock market reports, found that there was this sleepy oil company, Wilshire Oil, in Texas, got friends and family and neighbors to invest with him, bought enough shares, to have enough of a percentage of the stock in this company that he flew to the Wilshire headquarters, he was a short guy, by the way, 5 feet 5.5 inches. So he would fluff his hair up very high. He wanted to give himself a little bit extra equity with people in the room. So he walked into the room with these obviously non-Jewish. The oil industry was not particularly
Friendly to Jews at that point.
not particularly friendly to Jews. He walked in. He said, "Gentlemen, you have no fear. My investors and I are not looking to execute a hostile takeover here. We think we can make you money and we can make ourselves money. And with that," he said, "I'm here to answer any questions you have." So they made fun of him and said, "Who are you, this little guy, to come in here and tell us our business? You have no idea, you have no understanding, no background, no training in oil. Who do you think you are?" Siggi took off his jacket, folded it and put it on the table, rolled up his sleeve, showed them his Auschwitz prisoner number tattooed on his arm, and said, "You know, gentlemen, the last person to try to intimidate me was Hitler. He didn't succeed, and neither will you." And he put on his jacket, walked out. He and his investors bought more shares in the company and eventually took over the company and grew it to the point where I think by the time it was sold by his children after his passing, it left more than $4 billion in assets. So here's this little guy with no education arriving here with $200 and leaving behind an oil and banking empire with more than $4 billion in assets. Not bad, not bad.
And he's the only guy we know who sued the Federal Reserve.
True. The Fed did not like that this fellow owned both a bank, trust company in New Jersey, as well as an oil company. They accused him of a conflict of interest. They say, "You're using proceeds from your bank to dig new wells for your oil company. This is a conflict of interest, and you're putting your depositors' resources at risk. So you have to divest of one or the other of your two companies." Siggi was furious at this. He said, "What are they talking about? I'm making money hand over fist for all of my investors, all of my depositors, everything is secured. They don't know what they're talking about." And he sued the Federal Reserve. Rajan Cohen, who was his banking lawyer from the august firm of Sullivan Cromwell, told me that to his knowledge, Siggi was the first person in American history to sue the Federal Reserve. Ultimately, he didn't win that battle, but he won the war. And I think people are going to have to read the book if they want to know more details about that. But he always found a way to push forward, always.
Now, Josh, let's talk a little bit about your career for a moment, because you have an incredible series of biographies of Holocaust survivors, and you have it written for young people with Scholastic. Tell us a little bit about the series, and then we'll talk about a couple of the survivors whom you've written about.
Yeah.
Ironically, and you and I can talk shorthand because we knew all of the survivors, but in a very real sense, we have to give you give the audience, give our people who are participating in this a sense of the diversity of these people, and also the enormous range of experiences.
I'll answer your question, Michael. Thank you for asking. I'm going to take a half step back to tell a quick story that I was with Elie Wiesel going up in an elevator to a video studio where he had agreed to record openings for a series of edited testimonies for from the Fortunoff Video Archive at Yale. And as we're going up in the elevator, we're looking at each other and we had the same thought. Namely, is this going to make any difference at all? And I said it to him out loud. I said, Ellie, I'm sorry. I cannot tell you that these videos are going to change anything. His arms shot up in the air. His eyes got big. And he said, we have to try. We have to try. And I suppose I was concerned enough that the adult biographies that I was asked to write might not change anyone's point of view on things. So when the opportunity came to do memoirs of young women who survived the Holocaust for Scholastic Publishing, which is the largest children's book publisher in the world, I jumped at the opportunity because young people, they're still formulating their values. They're still formulating their impressions. That's, I think, a ripe field for Holocaust education. So that's been a very, very rewarding experience. I have you to thank for that. You introduced me to, there are 6 books in the series. You introduced me to at least half the subjects for these books. So thank you for that.
Well, tell us a little bit, just go through very briefly. One was Fania Heller, the other was Vladka Mead, Renee Hartman, whom you knew. But give us just a sense of who these women, but they were girls in one sense when they went through this, as Ziggy was a boy when he
Yes.
went through this.
It,
Ziggy arrived at Auschwitz at 17, and they were young girls at this point.
it's something that I think sometimes we overlook, that when we talk about the Holocaust, we're talking about the lives of very, very young people for the most part. It was extraordinary that anyone survived. But here we have in this series, this was a formula that Scholastic asked me to follow. They wanted to show that young people can make a difference. They wanted to show that young women in particular have agency, to use that word. And so the stories that were included in this series, starting with Fania Heller, whom you introduced me to. Fania was a force of nature. She was a hidden child in Ukraine, 16, 17 years old, when she and her family had to live in a chicken coop behind a barn in the middle of winter. And there was a young Ukrainian policeman who fell in love with her. Fania was a very attractive young woman, did what she had to do to keep her family alive. You know, that's something that's important, I think, to point out here in the context of our gathering here this evening, Michael. I've screened maybe 500, 600 hours of testimony at the Yale Archives. Not once have I ever heard a survivor refer to herself or himself as a hero. They speak of the unheroic things they had to do just to stay alive.
Even when they were heroic, meaning you did a memoir of Vladka Mead, Feigl Peckel, who was regarded by everybody else as a hero of the Warsaw Ghetto resistance, an arms purchaser, a woman who brought dynamite into the ghetto. Dynamite, the word she couldn't even pronounce, and yet alone know how to use, but she never regarded herself as heroic.
No.
She did what had to be done.
That's right. At the ripe old age of 17, 18, her resource was that she did not have typical Jewish looks. She looked like an Aryan young woman. So she was able to go back and forth over the ghetto wall into what was called the Aryan section, to look for homes that would take children who had been orphaned because their parents had been murdered inside the ghetto, arms, bullets, dynamite that she was able to purchase and then sneak back over the wall to give to the Warsaw Ghetto fighters, who were all young people. These were young children, 14, 15, 16. The oldest one might have been in his late 20s.
And the commander was a 24-year-old. The commander was Mordechai Onelevich, a 24-year-old. Again, you think of youth and what they were capable of. And tell us a bit about Renee Hartman, because her heroism or her accomplishment, which others will see as heroic, was very special and very unique, and began when she was a young child.
Renee, who was married to Jeffrey Hartman, who was the first academic advisor to the Fortunoff Video Archive at Yale back in the late 1970s.
And a sterling professor at Yale, and himself a German Jewish refugee.
A renowned scholar of literature. Renee was the only hearing person in her family. Both her parents and her younger sister were deaf. So she had to be their ears. When the sound of the Nazi boots came down the street where their apartment was in Bavaria in Bratislava, she was the one who had to sign to her family, "We have to go and hide now." And her parents were deported, and she took her younger sister by the hand, and they went looking for food and a place to stay. And eventually, she decided that they were going to die in the streets if they had to go on like this. So she, holding her younger deaf sister's hand, presented themselves at the local police station and said, "We wish to go with our parents." They didn't know that their parents were already dead. They'd been sent to Auschwitz. So the train was deep toured on the way to Auschwitz. They ended up going to Bergen-Belsen. And in Bergen-Belsen, Renee told me she and her younger sister Herta never let go of each other's hand. If they had, Herta would have been finished. She would have gotten lost and she couldn't speak. She couldn't understand what people were saying. So for a year and a half, they held hands. And it's interesting that that story was picked up by Marlee Maitland, the deaf actress, who had been looking for the story of a deaf child in the Holocaust. Someone told her about the book, which is called Signs of Survival. She brought it to her friend Steven Spielberg, whom you know, and they decided to adopt the book as a 4-part television series. So we don't know when that will happen yet, but I was able to explain for Renee before she passed away last year that her story will be reaching a new generation of young people, and she was very happy about that.
And I heard, I was at a session in which Madeline was speaking, and she described how the book impacted her
Hmm.
and all that she felt, and how she'd been looking. She said, "This is the task of a lifetime to bring this to the public. It's part of it." So you've worked in film as well, Joshua?
With some modest success doing documentaries for PBS and Discovery. The first one was called Witness Voices from the Holocaust, and that was based on the testimony from the Yale archive. And when that aired on PBS, the phone kept ringing, mostly survivors looking for someone to help tell their story. And I politely declined because, frankly, I think I had a touch of clinical depression at that point. This is not an easy field to be working in, as you well know. At that point, my wife said to me, "You got to find something else to write about." So she says, you always have nice things to say about the late Beatle George Harrison, because I knew him briefly in London. She said, "Why don't you write his story?" So I did. That was a nice break, telling George Harrison's story. in any case, we're here to talk about Siggi, and there's a lot to talk about there. But thank you for bringing up the children's series. I think that's important. If Siggi were here today, Michael, I think he would, and if someone were to ask him, what is the most important lesson that you would like us to understand? He would say, teach the Holocaust, teach the Holocaust, teach the Holocaust, especially to young people. Because if you do not teach the Holocaust, then you leave the door open to history repeating itself. And he didn't hold back. He was an eloquent speaker. He accepted every invitation to tell his story. And he did not hold back from telling the tough parts. He wanted people to understand what we're dealing with here.
But you began the brief video of Siggi with Siggi dancing. And that is that I knew Siggi, and one of the things that impressed me most of all is the man had a zest for life.
Yeah.
A
Yes, he did.
zest for life, a passion for life.
Yeah.
In one sense, as only somebody who knew death and who had been intimate with death and who had been given a second opportunity could embrace life with that intensity. So the scene that you have at the beginning is, number one, Siggi in a tuxedo having a blast. It's probably the bar mitzvah of one of his sons, and he's welcoming everybody there. And boy, is he going to have a good time. And survivors also had an interesting phrase at that point. They would say, "Liegt in dread nicht tanzen v'chasana." He's lying in the ground and I'm dancing at a wedding. So in that sense, you show the enormous passion he had for life. He also, ironically, and you saw this in him as a banker, and you said it in terms of his investors. He really cared about the people who banked with him, who invested with him, and he wanted to do good by them, make them all money. And he would have a very special character in terms of the way in which he engaged with the public, not only with the rich and the affluent, but with ordinary folks all the way through.
Very old school. He earned his depositors for Trust Company of New Jersey, one depositor, one customer at a time. And he would do it by, I'll give you an example. A woman came into the bank in Union City, New Jersey, one of the ultimately 100 branches that he opened for Trust Company Bank. And Siggi went over to her and he said, "Oh, madam, you're so beautiful." And he started playing with her hair. And she's looking, who is this guy? What are you doing? And he said, "Madam, I'm the president of the bank. I happen to also own a chain of beauty parlors. You're exquisite. You're so beautiful, but I can even make you more beautiful." And she says, "Oh, really? Can I get an appointment?" And he looked at her with this feeling of being insulted. "Oh, are you kidding? We're booked up for months." And he stormed off. By the end of the day, she had brought all of her money to him. He was doing all of her deposits, all of her investment strategies, and that was Siggi Wilzig.
And I dealt with him at the Holocaust Museum, and part of what he did at a transitional moment was, I don't mean this with any disrespect, but Elie Wiesel was not the greatest administrator.
Not the best, right?
not the best administrator. Nobody could do what Elie Wiesel did, and he wasn't quite skilled as an administrator. So
Accounting wasn't his forte.
Siggi stepped in and he said, "This is what you have to do." And all of a sudden, everybody had to have job descriptions. Everybody had to have evaluations. Everybody had to have
The letters of recommendation, everything.
everything like that. And I don't know if we can get away with the words bullshit, but there was no bullshit allowed.
No, he did not let anyone get away with anything. And sometimes it wasn't appreciated because he was a yeller. I mean, the way I found out about him is that his son Ivan had read some of my other books, called me one day. This is about 8 years ago, 9 years ago now, and yelled at me. We'd never met. He yells at me on the phone. He says, "You're the one." I say, "I'm sorry. Who is this?" He says, "You're the one who's going to write my father's story." I'm very sorry, but I'm done. It's a very dark time, and I just want to go toward the light now. When he says, "You don't get it. My father was the light. He was a torch of hope for every immigrant who ever came to America." And he went on and would not take no for an answer, something he learned from his father. And the more I looked into it, the more I realized Ivan was not exaggerating. His father was a force of nature, and he was wonderful. I became so enamored of Siggi. He would get up in a restaurant. He'd go out to have a meal with his family. And in the middle of the meal, he'd get up and start dancing. If I were a man today. And people are looking around and they're asking his kids, "Does your father own the restaurant or what?" I say, "No, he just loves his life."
And he embraced it with intensity and with zest, but he also did something else, which when I read the book for the first time, I wrote a one sentence review of it, which always struck me, and you have it a little bit in that video, which is Ziggy left Auschwitz, but Auschwitz never left Ziggy.
Yeah.
And what I love about what you did is the wedding is there, the intensity of life is there, the joy is there, the sparkle, the dynamism, the charisma, the excitement, the engagement, all of those are there, and Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And somehow in his life, they were not two things, they were fused.
Yeah.
They were there together.
Right. Look, Michael, you know this better than anybody. Part of the disappointment in much of Holocaust representation in film, in art, in literature, is that that side is neglected because it's too hard to bear. Without the Hollywood ending, we won the war, survivors, we're left only with the reality. And that's too cruel and difficult. It's the stuff of nightmares. Who wants to expose their children to those kinds of stories? Who wants to live with that? The survivors have no choice. For them, those memories are living memories. It's not the past. You don't get over the Holocaust, as you say. But Siggy somehow managed to channel his demons into building a business, not because he was so enamored of money. Money was a means to an end for him. Money was the way he could earn a platform of power and authority so that when he spoke about the Holocaust, people would have to listen. That was his mission.
And I remember most particularly, Ziggy had a real involvement at West Point.
Yeah.
He had a real involvement at West Point. In other words, the cadets listened to him, not only because he was a survivor, but because of all that he had accomplished in the outside world that gave him the credibility to speak to them, to touch them, to engage them, to challenge them, and to work with them. We're going to now, Sydney, we're going to invite you now to ask some questions because I was given instructions that I had to give time to everybody. And Sydney was about to pull the plug on me if I didn't allow her to ask some questions. So
Well, I appreciate you giving us the time to ask the questions, and I want to thank
we gotta kid her a little bit, but she's one tough one
I
tough.
run a tight ship. What can I say? I also just put in the chat again the link where you can buy the book. So for those of you who are out there, so I want to start with just kind of a clarifying question. Siggy, was liberated from Mathausen, correct? He was not liberated from Auschwitz.
That is correct. That
Okay.
is correct. He spent 2 years in Auschwitz, slave labor and so on. And then as the Russians were approaching from the east toward the end of the war, the remaining administrators in Auschwitz did what now afterwards came to be known as the Death March. And they were in the middle of winter with hardly any clothes and no food and so on. They were marched out to camps farther inside Nazi Germany. The idea was that they were going to hide their crimes somehow from the Allies. And so the last place was for Siggi was Mathausen, which was liberated by American forces. And at that point, he was down to something on the order of 82 pounds, some skeletal condition.
Thank you for clarifying that. We also had a few people asking us a bit about Siggy's educational background, like how did he learn to run a bank and run all these businesses? What was his schooling like? How was it disrupted by the war?
Right. Well, the answer is it's uncanny. Of course, Jewish children were forbidden to attend school at a certain point.
Mhm.
And so Siggy never graduated from the equivalent of elementary school. You had the equivalent of a partial elementary school education. The rest was life experience.
But he got his, we always say he got his PhD at Auschwitz.
Yes.
He got a PhD in life.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it, which we also have to say, is he had an intuitive way of understanding people.
Mhm.
Because he studied people when his life was dependent upon understanding who he was facing. And that's a hell of an education. None of us should have to experience that education. But Siggy would sometimes say, I got my doctorate at Auschwitz.
You imagine what it's like in an environment where the only information you have is hearsay. The prisoners will say, "Don't go near that one. He's a beater. He'll beat. Stay away from that guard there." To the point where during the war crimes trials, hearsay evidence was admitted into the trials for that very reason, that the eyewitnesses had all gone up the chimneys. But those few who remained and could say, we knew by word of mouth, Siggy picked up what he needed to pick up. He was a brilliant liar. I mean, he heard that the guards needed master bricklayers. So he stepped forward and whipped off his cap and said, I had 5 years as a master bricklayer. He said, I knew about as much about bricklaying as you know about belly dancing. But he did what he needed to do to survive, and he learned on the job, and he ended up teaching the other prisoners how to lay bricks and save their lives.
Wow. I mean, he seems like such an amazing man. So that's amazing to hear. We also had a couple of questions about, so you mentioned that you first heard about Siggy from his son, Ivan. But people are also wondering, have you had an opportunity to meet any other members of his immediate family? And also what has their reaction to the book been?
Oh, the family was extraordinarily gracious and receptive and encouraging, and worked diligently to make sure that every detail, every fact, every reported story in the book is as accurate as possible. Not just the family, but former employees in his bank, former customers of the bank, staff, legal teams, friends, people he knew from his synagogue. There were about 100 interviews conducted for the book, and everybody had a Siggi story to tell. Everyone had some amazing story. There could be volumes 2 and 3 of the life of Siggi Wilzig.
And Josh, let's be fair also, and I'm using both terms positively. They were demanding. In other words, they were demanding and they were tough, but they were tough for quality and for accuracy.
Oh, very much so.
And you wouldn't expect anything less of them.
Yeah, no, they were you're right. They were quite demanding in terms of making sure that everything was verified. They wouldn't let me get away with any sloppy research. That's for sure.
That's great to hear. So we also had a question that came in, since you've written a number of Holocaust biographies, what is the most challenging or difficult part about writing a biography of a Holocaust survivor?
The most difficult part of writing the story of a Holocaust survivor is readers' incredulity that such extreme things could have ever happened, particularly when we're dealing with young people. I mean, the books for Scholastic are for 13 and 14-year-olds, and this is so far outside their frame of reference. Look, I used to teach Holocaust at Hofstra University out here on Long Island, and freshmen would ask me questions like, well, what did the Jews do on weekends in the concentration camps? Was there a gym? Was the food kosher? I mean, it's so far, the Holocaust to a young mind is something that happened a million years ago, a million miles away, to people who speak in such thick accents, who can understand what they're saying, and their stories are absolutely unbelievable.
And remember something else, which is we still use the word inconceivable, unthinkable, unspeakable when we describe what's happening there, but actually it couldn't be inconceivable because it was conceived. It couldn't be unimaginable because it was imagined. It couldn't be unspeakable because people have spoken of it. So part of that, and let me also say that something Joshua does phenomenally well, which is he knows how to communicate truthfully and with real integrity for the experience without being overtly brutal in such a way that it would frighten a person reading the book. And that is, he invites them to get more deeply into the story, even when the story itself is frightening.
I think that kind of leads us into another question that we got from the audience, which is how have children reacted to the books that you've written for young readers?
I feel very fortunate. I get letters and emails from young people saying thank you for telling Vlad Kamid's story or telling Celia Kassau's story. Celia was a partisan in Poland. I did not know about these things. I'm not Jewish, but I can understand that this is important for me to understand, to know about. Very, very heartfelt, wonderful expressions of appreciation. But at the same time, there are moments that make me quite sad. There was a young man in one of the classes that I taught, and sometimes to make sure they understand what it is we're dealing with, I'll tell a story intentionally. This is not to contradict Michael, but to get a sense of what we're dealing with. Sometimes describing the reality of what happened kind of shocks an audience into a certain perspective. There's a story, for example, in something called the Buchenwald Report, which described how a woman had a young baby and a German soldier approached her. this was during a time of deportation and babies were not allowed. So he said, give me the child, and the mother refused. So the officer grabbed the baby out of the mother's arms and tore the baby in half in front of the mother. Now, how do you incorporate a story like that into our understanding of humanity? Well, the answer is you can't, and you don't. When I told that story, this young man raised a hand and said, how do you do that? And he put his hands up in the air as if he was trying to understand, how do you tear a child in half? Now, we have to be prepared to forgive him for that. It was so outside his frame of reference. That's the only thing he thought to do, was mathematically, physically, how do you make that happen? It was a horrible moment, but it kind of drove home for me just how important it is that we keep educating, that we keep trying, because otherwise the Holocaust risks becoming another moment in history, like the French Revolution or the Peloponnesian Wars or something, and the importance, the immediacy, the urgency can get lost.
Thank you. So we are almost at the end of our time, but I do want to ask one kind of final question that a lot of people are wondering is kind of what, if you, I know it's hard to distill down Siggy's life, because he lived such an extraordinary life, but if there is sort of one lesson you wanted people to take from the book or from his life, what would it be?
Well, I think Siggy would say, don't give in to despair. He would say, you know, the world is filled with snakes and spiders and frightening things, but is also filled with flowers and lovely moments. I'm quoting him here. And Siggy, to get away from the pressure of his work, would go, there was a hotel in the Midwest where they have, I think, 30 acres of sculpted flower gardens. And he would just go there and spend a few days wandering through the flower gardens, because the scale of the ugliness that he had known was so extreme that the beauty needed to be extreme as well. So I think he would say, expose yourself to beauty. Remember that it is a marvelous world. Yes, terrible things happen, but don't focus just on that.
And from my perspective, I think Ziggy would probably say you don't have to be defined by your past. You can be defined by what you do with that past and how you march it into the future. And that's a lesson for us about resilience and a lesson about how you bring the past into the future. And that I thought was part of what he represented.
Well, I think that is an excellent note to end on. So I want to thank both of you, Joshua and Michael, for being with us today and for that really amazing discussion and for answering all these questions. We really appreciate it. I highly encourage everyone to purchase Unstoppable, which you can do at the link in the chat. And if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support, and also joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. Joshua, Michael, thank you both so much again. Thank you to everyone who joined us. Have a great evening, and we'll see you all soon.